The Crucible, the Salem witch trials. A lot of you know the Crucible because we had to read it in high school. Many of us had to read it in high school. You may know the movie from 1996 starring Daniel Day-Lewis. Basically, what happened in Salem was an outbreak of witch hysteria. Now, witch hysteria was not new at this time, and perhaps they should have known better, but we'll get to that later. Witch hysteria was not new at this time. It wasn't even new to New England. But Salem was different because it was the largest outbreak. And it happened at a time when everyone really should have known better because the witch hysteria was basically passing. It was almost done in Europe. It was almost done in England. And yet the New England colonies, Massachusetts Bay, Salem in particular, just lost their mind for about a year. They just lost it. This is my familiar. He needs to go in the bedroom. Cosmo Cat, say hi to the people. Remember in our Death to Smarty Pants video when we went over Margaret Jones? She was one of the earlier women to be killed in the colonies, so it was not new. Now, the difference between an outbreak, a witch hysteria outbreak, and just, the normal witchcraft accusation is that a lot of people were accused. A lot of people were caught up in this, rather than just the stray witch hanged here and there, or the stray witch set on fire here and there. An outbreak happens when it's like a disease. It's a mental disease. It happens when one person gets accused and then they're told to name names, remember, and then other people get accused. And this madness sort of sweeps across the entire community and a lot of people get swept up in it and a lot of people get accused. So 1692, Massachusetts Bay, Salem colonies, it's right above Boston. Which is interesting because there was a port in Boston and they were getting books. We went over this in the We Were Warned 35 years ago, amusing ourselves to death video, kind of, that they were getting books. So we'll come back to that later, but I'm sort of doubtful that the upper crust, the learned people of Boston didn't know any better, but they didn't know any better, let's just say. 1692, Salem, Mass, a group of girls, half dozen to a dozen, start to become possessed. And possession sort of is similar to what we discussed in the Internet is Making Us Crazy video in Leroy, New York, that sort of possession thing, the same, similar symptoms even. Fainting, seizures, except they were understanding it through this prism of witches are real, witches are causing this. So very similar pattern to stuff we experienced in 2012. Leroy was 2012. Still goes on today, though. So these group of girls get possessed, and they start accusing others. And then more people get possessed because this is how it happens. It spreads. The possession spreads. And more people get accused, and more people get accused. By the time it was all over, 19 people were hanged. One person was crushed to death. And then 5 people died in the awful conditions in the jail, at least 5 people. I mean, you have to understand that this is New England colonial, so even just being left to the elements could be a death sentence. So if those jails weren't kept well, and we see that they weren't, people would die in them. And that's what happened. And it's just awful. And it has captivated the American mind for hundreds of years since then. Okay, for the sake of everybody's sanity, we're going to assume that there were not witches operating in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, people have different views on witchcraft. Even today, people still believe in witchcraft. I was watching John Campbell the other day, and he brought on a doctor from Africa who was explaining to this family that their daughter was not bewitched, that was not causing her jaundice, and they should take her to a regular hospital and not a witch doctor. So yes, people still believe in witchcraft. I'm not going to go over all of that. Let's just assume there were no witches in the Salem colony, that there were no witches in Europe at this time, in England at this time. Maybe there were people practicing folk traditions, but at least in Salem, it's very unlikely that these women were witches in any way, shape, or form. This was a very Christian colony. These women were very, I don't want to say boring people. Maybe they were mouthy. Of course, some of them were mouthy, but they were Christian. This was not practicing pagan beliefs in 1692 in Salem. So for the sake of everybody's sanity, let's just say that there were no witches in New England, that there were no witches in England or Europe, and if they felt that they were witches, it may have been undiagnosed mental illness. So basically, we have a fear, a hysteria over absolutely nothing at all. Also, if there were witches, and these people were witches that they were hanging, why didn't they use their witchcrafts to not be hanged? You would think if you have magical powers, the first thing you use these magical powers for is not to get hanged. We're not going to scratch away this logic too much, because once you scratch away this logic, it's just so infuriating. It's too annoying. I watched The Crucible again yesterday with some of my girlfriends, and they were horrified the entire time, especially the one that had not been forced to read The Crucible in high school. What kind of high school she went to doesn't force you to read The Crucible, but the whole time, she was just horrified. How could this happen? I don't know. Why does it keep happening? That's the question. And when I say we cannot peel away at this witchcraft logic, you really can't. Because they said the most ridiculous thing about these women. They said that they were flying on broomsticks. We saw in the movie, I saw Goody so-and-so flying on a broomstick over the mountain. No, you didn't. You didn't. Goody so-and-so came in through the keyhole to my bedroom and harassed me in the night. No, she didn't. And I just wonder sometimes, the people saying these things, do they genuinely believe it? Have they questioned themselves at all? Are they going through some sort of delusion? I don't have time for it in this video. We're going to get to the movie, The Crucible, 1996, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, Joan Allen, and Winona Ryder, written by Arthur Miller and adapted for the screen by Arthur Miller, because we know that he wrote the original Crucible in 1953, the stage play. He adapted it for a film in 1996. Fantastic. You can tell that he knows a lot about what happened at Salem, that he's very well studied in it. He mentions in his New Yorker article that he went through this 1,000-page text when he was in university to learn about it. So you could tell that this man knows what happened at the witch trial. This is very historically accurate. I love Arthur Miller. He is before our time. Unfortunately, he died in 2005, but you may recognize his voice from Ken Burns' The Civil War. He's the voice of General Sherman and the voice of John Brown. So be still my heart. I love this man. The movie opens with a tracking shot. We're following these girls into the woods. They're doing a dance. There's a butt. We see a few boobs. It's dancing and spellcraft. And then Reverend Paris comes in, interrupts the whole thing. So we get the drama of this. We're already drawn in. In that opening sequence in the movie, we see that the girls are casting a spell to get husbands. And they're looking around at the young men in the village and they say, I want this one, I want that one. And this is actually one of those things that's very historically accurate, because these girls were servant girls, and just the way that the class structure was set up in New England at that time, there was no guarantee that they were going to get a husband, even if they were somewhat pretty. As Abigail was said to be somewhat pretty, not in real life, but in the screenplay that Arthur Miller wrote, she's said to be very pretty, but there's no guarantee that she's going to get a husband, because the dowry situation, the society at that time, very different than what we're dealing with now. Even in Boston, even at that area, it was a different world. So they felt that they had to resort to spell casting to get a husband. Fantastic. That shows that Arthur Miller understood the class dynamics in Puritan New England. I love it. I love everything about it. And they have the slave, Tituba, and she has knowledge of charms from Barbados. This is the only African-American character in the play. Makes perfect sense, because at that time, why would a black person, not quite an African-American yet, why would a black person be in Puritan New England? Why would anybody be in Puritan New England unless you were born in Puritan New England? Because they had options. Like, what are you doing in Salem, Mass? Well, she's there because she's a slave. She has the knowledge of these charms, and she's a young woman as well. In this, she's a young woman. In the movie, she's a young woman. In the play, she's meant to be older, but she's a young woman, and they're just having fun in the forest, these girls. But in Puritan New England, there's no having fun in the forest. There's no dancing. There's no spell casting. These things will get you whipped. And they did use physical punishment back then. So the setup that we have is that the Reverend, unpopular man in town catches his niece and his daughter dancing in the forest over this pot of this brew, this witch's brew, and he doesn't know what to do. His daughter Betty falls ill. She goes into a coma, the first of the hysterics. And it just sets off this wave of madness over Salem, Massachusetts. They call in Reverend Hale, and it just spreads and it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. They say the devil is here. Why else would these girls be bewitched in this fashion? Some people point out, Goody Nurse, she points out that, well, they're young girls. They're goofy. They're silly. I've been a young girl. We were stupid. We had fun. We played games. We danced. I mean, it's typical, but Puritan New England didn't really allow for that. They didn't really allow for young women to be young women. They were supposed to be seen and not heard, especially girls this age, unmarried girls. It was a backward culture. It was a different time. It was a backward culture. Anyway, they're dancing in the forest. Father comes, finds them. Poof. Now the adults are involved. Now the church is involved. Now we have more people coming in and trying to find what is wrong. Now the law is involved, and it doesn't have to be. So I don't mean to ruin it. If you haven't watched The Crucible by now, I don't know what is stopping you. If you are not aware of the Salem witch trials, you're probably in the same company as my friend who was not forced to read it in high school for some reason. Not to throw shade on her backwards high school, but whatever. You are not aware that 185 people were accused. 185 people. This is a huge number, not just from the town of Salem, but from surrounding towns as well. The possessed girls started off with a few, and then it spread and it spread and it spread like Leroy, New York. And for some reason, the mob was on board with this. The crowd was on board with this. And when these girls are in the courtroom spewing this nonsense, imagination, whatever's going through their imagination, when they're in the courtroom spewing this, there's so many oohs and ahs from the crowd, like, oh, she's a witch. Oh, there's a specter over there. Oh, they're cold, they're fainting. So the mob is the most important part of this whole movie, because nothing happens without the mob. Yes, a young girl can scream all she wants. If a judge isn't going to try the accused, if the hangman isn't going to hang them, if the townspeople aren't going to stand by and watch it happen, then nothing happens from these accusations. You need the mob. You need the town participating in this shared delusion. In The Crucible, you'll know that it is kind of a love story. It's about a scorned girl, Abigail Williams, and she wants the heart of John Proctor. Now, John Proctor is married. John Proctor is played by Daniel Day-Lewis. He's a young man, prime health. You definitely see what Abigail is looking at when she sees John Proctor. But Elizabeth Proctor's in the way. Mrs. Proctor is in the way. So she asks Tituba, can you get rid of Elizabeth Proctor with this spell? Tituba says, no, that's bad. Abigail takes it too far, drinks the chicken's blood, does not get her wish in the end. In real life, John Proctor would have been 60 years old and Abigail would have been 11. I don't believe there's any evidence at all to suggest there was a relationship between the two. This is just spicing it up for the movies. It didn't really happen. But we understand scorned women. We understand love lost. So that's why it's in the movie. You know, it's 1950s. You know, we gotta make this sexy. We can't just be watching Puritans be Puritans. No one wants to see that. Really, nobody wants to see that. You do not want to see that. And if you do want to see that, you can go to Plymouth, Mass, and they have like this live action constant. They have the village. The village of Plymouth is still up and running, and they have actors playing the roles. So you can go see it if you want. And I encourage you to. I encourage you to go see it and to buy some fudge and to get a candle and go look at The Rock. But are you going to rent a movie or go to a movie or go to the theater to see it? They're churning a lot of butter over there. Anyway, the Salem witch trials took place over about a year. It sort of spread through the town, and then just as quickly as it spread, it broke. The fever broke. Everyone got over it, and they were like, wow. We really screwed that one up. Our bad. 25 dead. Whoopsie. Big old whoopsie, huh? Basically, these girls, they got possessed. There was all this drama involved in that. They accused hundreds of people. Some confessed. If you confessed in Salem, you were let off. which is unique to the Salem witch trials, because other witch trials in New England, if you confessed, you were put to death, because it says in the Bible, we will not allow a witch to live, or something biblical like that. So will not suffer a witch to live. So it says that one line in the Bible. It says a lot of stuff in the Bible they didn't listen to, like thou shalt not kill, but they listened to this one. So they would not allow a witch to live otherwise. But in Salem, which is unique, they said that if you confessed, then you did get to live. And John Proctor points this out in the movie. He says, of course, all these people are confessing to witchcraft. You're letting them live if they confess. Did you not think about that? It shows that there were a few people in Salem that did have sense. And the John Proctor character is one of those people. He had some sense in real life and in the movie. He's like, yeah, it looks like 2 + 2 = 4. Are you seeing that 2 + 2 = 4? And they're like, 2 + 2 = 5. And he's like, it looks like it equals 4. And then they hanged him. I can't be telling people 2 + 2 = 4. Sometimes I get mad at you. In the movie, I love these scenes in the courtroom of these girls just being overly dramatic and people oohing and awing like it's an episode of Jerry Springer. The more things change, huh? Anyway, I don't know if those people believed it or if they were just participating in this drama. We see throughout history people just participate in the drama. And maybe they go home and they with their family over the dinner table and they say, I don't believe it, I don't buy it. I don't know. In times like this, in times of hysteria, oftentimes it is dangerous to even whisper to your loved ones that you don't buy it. Because we see, especially in witch trials, in witchcraft accusations, that sometimes the family turns over the mother or they turn over the grandmother and they launch accusations against their own kin. So I'm assuming some people went home and were just like, this is a bunch of bullshit. Can you believe this? But that could also be very dangerous. So maybe everybody was just terrified of saying anything at all until it became obvious, until there was a sort of that point where, that saturation point where enough people were saying that this is ridiculous. So I'm really not sure on that point. We kind of discussed this in the Groupthink video toward the end. In the movie is actually set on Hog Island in Essex, Massachusetts. They recreated the village of Salem as it was in 1692. When I first looked at it, I thought it was Plymouth, Mass, because the houses look like that. Puritan houses are so basic. From the outside, they are so basic. There's just a box of wood, and it should not be showy. It shouldn't be too much because they're simple people. They're living under God's law. They're living under God's word, and things should not be too flamboyant. So that's how the houses looked. That's how the houses look in Plymouth, Mass. Go visit Plymouth Village. It's fun. It's a fun day. They have good fudge. Okay fudge. Like era appropriate fudge. So it's like maple fudge, whatever. It's all right. Anyway, the houses are super basic. And they recreated this on Hog Island. Daniel Day-Lewis dove into that role. Just completely dove in. Didn't wash so he could be historically accurate. Built a house while he was there in the Plymouth style of building a house. You see in the movie, you're like, wow, costume and makeup did an amazing job of making him look really dirty. Turns out that's just Daniel Day being Daniel Day. You know, he really delivers for the role. He puts himself into the role. And a lot of us might be thinking, oh, stinky Daniel Day-Lewis out there? Oh, and he's got to kiss Joan Allen and she's taking that kiss at the end. But hey, he met his wife on that set, Arthur Miller's daughter. He's married to Arthur Miller's daughter, which, respect, that's like American artistic royalty. He's married to Arthur Miller's daughter, which means she saw him unshowered, building this basic ass house and thought, goddamn. I mean, you get it in like a assertive way, but also like he really put himself in that role. And props to Daniel Day-Lewis. Congratulations on your marriage. The play, The Crucible that this is based on. Like I said, we read it in high school. I went to high school in Rhode Island, which is a colony that broke off from Massachusetts Bay early on. because the people of Massachusetts were crazy. They were nuts. They were crazy, tightwad Puritans, full of hate, trying to hang everybody. So Rhode Island broke off early, and they're right under the bridge. Rhode Island is so close to Massachusetts, started by Roger Williams and Hutchinson, who got driven out of Massachusetts because they said she was a heretic, she was a mouthy woman. That's why she got driven out. So Massachusetts was on this kill the heretic thing for a while. They were almost from the beginning trying to isolate problematic people and get rid of them. Yes, they did leave England to escape religious persecution. That is a very good point. And so that hate for these people, that desire to purge these parts of the population, that sort of bled over into the witch accusations. Similar thing happened in Europe. It went from, okay, these are heretics, these are Jews, these are homosexuals against God. Okay, now we need more. We're killing a lot of these Jews, or we need something more. Okay, witches. And that's what they did. But they did that in late 1400s, so that like 1480s plus. That's when they did that in Europe. This is 200 years later. Back to the play. The play was written in 1953 during the height of the Red Scare, the second Red Scare. And Arthur Miller wrote it because they were going through mass hysteria. If you don't know about the Red Scare, it was basically the House of Un-American Activities, Joseph McCarthy, were terrified that communists were going to come in and take over like they had done in the Soviet Union. So anybody who had any affiliation with communist or socialist at all were blacklisted, their names tarnished. People had to go underground. I've got a whole thing on this, but I don't have time to do it in this video. It will be addressed in another video. That basically Arthur Miller was seeing this, and he was seeing how people had just lost it, and that they should have known better. And that's the thing about Salem as well, is that they should have known better because Rhode Island knew better. Rhode Island is right across the way, knowing better this whole time. So why didn't the people of Salem, Massachusetts know better? There is this argument that you can't take people out of history, for the time they lived in, this is what they believed, but yo, Rhode Island, right over the bridge. It is shockingly close to Massachusetts, and they knew better down there. So I don't know if I buy this argument in the least that the people of Massachusetts were just expressing an ideology of their time. Maybe, but not the upper classes, not the judges. They should have known better. Anyway, that's not the point. The thing about the Red Scare that's very interesting is that it went from the Soviets are our allies in World War II. The labor parties helped us secure a decent quality of life before that, to anyone associated with this at all is evil. And it happened so quickly, and that's why one of the reasons Arthur Miller thought that he should write this play, to let us know how this can happen. We've been through this before. Let's not go through it again. How many times have we been through it since Arthur Miller wrote this? Let's just count. Okay. Satanic Panic after 9/11. The Russians are coming. The Russians are going to infiltrate and do whatever they think the Russians are going to do that we're not already doing to them. Okay, we're not going to count out all the times throughout history or since 1953 that we've been through this. But we've been through it. We're not talking about now. Stop trying to make this about now. This is about history. Arthur Miller's on his deathbed like, oh, they're not going to do it again because I wrote that book. The last thing anyone said to Arthur Miller on his deathbed is, don't worry, you solved mass hysteria. It won't happen again. I really like the idea of someone in Rhode Island at a pub in Rhode Island in 1692, just hearing about what's going on in Salem. Just like having a logger and the fur trader comes through and says, have you heard what's going on in Salem right now? And you're like, oh my God, tell me more. This big old picture. Tell me more. And you're just there. You just listen to all the gossip, all the tea. And you're just like, okay, well, this is why we left Massachusetts to begin with. Because they're crazy up there. You can't deal with the people from Massachusetts. I feel that this was the first time in history the phrase couldn't be me was ever spoken. Because everyone from Rhode Island knew that they should get out of Massachusetts. So, whatever. I just really like the thought of that. Just, ooh, salivating at the juicy gossip. Because you get to look down on others, which everyone likes looking down on others. Plus, the story. This is a story. Salem, Mass is a story. I don't believe that we are the first people to secretly enjoy terrible things happening in the news. And you know Americans secretly enjoy terrible things that happen in the news. That's why the news media is so big. So I don't believe we're the first people. We're doing it in 1692 anyway. Anyway. Moving on. We sort of have to figure out how many people at the time genuinely believed in witches and how many people were going along with it. Because we see in the story that some people genuinely believed the possessed. Maybe the possessed genuinely believed it themselves to a certain degree. And some in the audience, including Mrs. Putnam, believed that there were witches about. But some people, like her husband, Thomas Putnam, just wanted land. They were using this as a pretense to gain some land, to gain economically, to purge Salem of undesirables because there was a conflict prior to this in Salem. And they thought this was an excuse to purge Salem of those people of the other tribe, the other. So how much of Salem was authentic and how much of it was just a play for power? We don't know. People have varying degrees of how much they believed these things. Now, folk tradition goes back for a long, long time. They believed that women, particularly women, were capable of certain things, of powers that they had because they had knowledge of healing, because they were midwives, and that was like an icky for men. So they didn't understand what the women knew, and they thought that because these women had this knowledge that it must be from the devil. And they were generally suspicious of women. They were suspicious of women, particularly older women, and they were not good people. I don't care how much they're preying on the Bible or whatever. The women that they accused in these witchcraft allegations, not just Salem, but all around New England, who were they? They were women who didn't have husbands, or mostly, women who didn't have husbands or sons to defend them. They were older women past their usefulness. They were poor women who maybe they felt bad. The colonists felt bad because they couldn't give them bread or beer or whatever these women might need. They didn't have anyone to look out for them, so they were sort of wards of the state. And so they punched down. They really punched down against people's, the age range of people's mothers and grandmothers. So no sympathy for the Puritans on this front in who they decided to go after. Salem was different because they started accusing people from upper class, people from the middle class. And this is the thing about the possessed, because in witch hunts, in witch trials, in witch allegations, most of the accusers were actually men. And then there are the accusers who are women, but who are not possessed. So they're within their right mind, and they'll accuse the neighbor of something. They have a beef with the neighbor. It's a way to settle the beef. Maybe they believed he was a witch too, whatever. But most of the actual accusers are not possessed. But in Salem, we have the possessed. And the possessed, they're just a wild card. They're pointing at everybody. You are a witch. You're a witch. You're a witch. Everybody's a witch. Anybody can get this. We see Winona Ryder's character, Abigail, saying, "Nobody is above the devil's reach." And the judge is like, I am. Excuse me, I am from the upper crust. I'm above the devil's reach. And so when you have this wild card of accusers out there, then anybody can get it. And that's sort of what brought the witch trials to an end, because you can't go accusing rich people. No, you can accuse the beggar woman. You can accuse this woman who's inherited this land that people don't think she's entitled to inherit. You can accuse those people, but you can't go accusing men. You can't go accusing upper class women. No. Now we know it's nonsense. But possession, as dramatic and annoying as it is actually a great equalizer, because they can accuse anybody. We can tell them otherwise. The devil's in them. Well, how do you know? And so they were like, oh, that's enough of that. That's enough of that. We're only using this as a device to get rid of people and take their land. Also, which is interesting, is that people had to pay for their imprisonment. They had to pay for the honor of being in this awful, damp cell in New England rather than a warm bed. They had to pay for that. And then, if they confessed or they were hanged, then their land was confiscated. Seems like there's a lot of economics involved, and we won't go into it. It's a mashup. It's a mashup of economics, of societal prejudice, of misogyny, and of course, a genuine belief in witchcraft. What I love about Salem, what I love about the Crucible, is it kind of covers not only 1600s hysteria, not only 1600s colonial history, but also 20th century American history. It's sort of marrying the two because we're looking at 1692 through a 1953 lens. And that's what I really, really love about it. And we see the similarities. We see so many similarities. We still see similarities in the hysteria. I'm going to do a whole series on hysteria because I have to at this point. But we see so many similarities in the hysteria despite the fact that the belief systems were radically different. But still, there's so many similarities. What's going on? It's fantastic. Anyway, here's a very, very interesting note from Arthur Miller.
They had subpoenaed me, and he finally called my lawyer, Joe Rao, and said, look, we'll call off the hearings if I can get a picture with Marilyn Monroe and just saying hello. And can you imagine all the people in the United States taking this seriously? And this man doing that. So I said, no, we'll have the hearing. I said, this is an absurdity.
Contrast this to the scene in which the judges say they'll let Proctor's wife live if he drops the accusations against the court. This happened after the Crucible was already written, so either Miller foreshadowed his future or politicians are goofy and predictable.
It simply taught me what I knew already, which is that there is nothing the politician won't stoop to if it means some publicity for him or some power. That's the nature of power, and people do whatever they can to achieve power and keep it.
It's kind of like one mass hysteria looking to another mass hysteria for guidance. It's like the present looking to the past for the lessons, which is why there is a past. We're supposed to take lessons out of the past. So we have this, which I just think is so beautiful. Plus Satan lore. I love Satan lore. You know I love Satan lore. So you combine that and you get Salem. Folk magic is not new. The thing about the satanic lore, which is interesting, because they had folk magic all through the Dark Ages. They had that stuff, and it wasn't really a problem because even in the upper classes, even with the scribes and the monks, they were like, well, God is all powerful. He's not going to allow Satan to just run rampant. And you see in the Middle Ages that the devil is sort of goofy. He's sort of like a mischievous character. But then around 1500 or so, 1400s, we get this marriage of from the very upper classes, from the learned people, supposedly learned people, they're learned for their time, whatever. They get the marriage of Satan with folk magic. And they say all folk magic comes from the devil, all power comes from the witches or these practitioners getting their power through demons, through the devil. So that's why witchcraft is so frowned upon in Christianity, because they got this idea from the 1400s that anything pagan, that the power comes from like a demon doing it. Prior to the witch hunts, Europe was actually less frightened of Satan. There's no time to go into it right now. Just note that the Satan lore has evolved since the beginning of Christendom. It is not static. Witchcraft allegations had been going on for a long time. They say the neighbor bewitched me. Like, okay, did you bewitch so-and-so? Whatever. Stop it. Pay him so many shekels or whatever you got to pay him. Just stop your bewitching. But then when the state got involved and the state got this mind virus in their head that the devil was to blame, this new satanic ideology, then it became a problem. And then we have the problem coming from the top down because the courts got themselves involved. I'm going to do an entire series on witchcraft in Europe and England. But for this, just know that the problem was the courts involved themselves. And we see this in the movie as well when it was Goody Nurse says, well, send Thomas Hale back. Send Reverend Hale back. We don't need him. We've already solved this. We don't want to involve the magistrates. We don't want to involve the state because then it'll just get messy. This is what happened. Here's just one thing to know. Why I believe that the upper classes in Massachusetts and in Salem should have known better is that it was already toward the end in England. And we know that they had that port in Boston and they were getting the books from England. And, you know, this was Enlightenment. Okay, fine. The farmer doesn't have time to read the latest treatise in Latin about whatever science, but the upper classes do. That's their only job. Your only job is to read and be informed. and then spread that information to the people. So they're either failing at their jobs miserably, which is possible, or they're using this as an attempt to maintain the puritanical order, which is also possible because after Salem, the Puritans were gone. They were like, that's enough of you. You are messing up our money. We're trying to be a colony here, trying to get that paper, and y'all are screwing it up with this God stuff. Y'all are screwing it up with this God stuff. So bye-bye Puritans. You've outlived your usefulness. We're gonna revamp. We're gonna rebrand the colony now, okay? Because y'all really gave it a bad name with all these hangings, with all these bodies. So come to Massachusetts, do your business. We don't hang people anymore. It's up to you whether you believe that they genuinely believe, the upper classes who were hanging these women genuinely believed in witchcraft, or if they were using this as a pretext to just get money and to solidify power. That's up to you. Now, the people believed all sorts of things about witches and women. They believed that these witches would screw up their marital bed, that they would make men impotent because, yeah, there was erectile dysfunction in the 1600s, but it wasn't a health issue. It wasn't the man's fault. It was a witch. A witch did it. The funniest thing, I remember noting this in one of the books I was reading, is the term hag-ridden. So if a man got a bad night's sleep, he wouldn't just say, oh, I couldn't go to bed last night. Oh, there was too many noises. Oh, I was too nervous. He would say that a witch had come into his bedroom and just smacked him around a little bit, maybe molested him a bit. And that's why he couldn't sleep. So the next day, if a man is restless, he'll get up and say, man, I feel really hag-ridden. Hag being, the witch, ridden. So maybe he got raped by the witch in the night. And this is how he feels. This is why he thinks he's getting a bad night's sleep. 2021, people still getting a bad night's sleep, not because of witches. Maybe try reading before you go to bed. Maybe, try clearing your mind of things. Probably not a witch, but the term hag-ridden is so funny. I want to bring it back. I don't know what context I would bring it back in, and I'd have to explain to people where it comes from. So I don't know if I'm going to go and do all that. But if you can find a way to bring hag-ridden back, to you. What we see in the social dynamic of these witch hunts, these witch accusations, is that a woman would be a problem. She'd be too mouthy. Maybe she'd make too many videos that upset people in the comment section on Odyssey. And then they would say, well, I don't like her. She's going against the hierarchy, da-da-da. And then when it's time for the witch outbreak, when it's time for the hysteria outbreak, they'll say, I know who's a witch. It's that one that made the video I don't like. It's her. And so this is what happens. So a woman, we see with the goat in the Crucible, the goat is in the garden and she says, get this goat out of my garden. I need these vegetables to eat so I don't die this winter. And they're like, witch. She's the witch. She needs to eat in the winter. Witch hanged. So wash, rinse, repeat. This is how it happened over and over again over these hundreds of years in Europe and in England, and that's how it happened in Salem as well. Women got mouthy and needed to be silenced, or women inherited land that isn't their land because only a man gets to inherit land, and there was a shortage of land, so witch. Older women, it tended to be older women being accused, women over 40, women past their reproductive years. Yes, there were a few men here and there was a child, which is why Salem was more of a hysteria, in addition to being part of this general social trend. So a lot was going on in Salem. It wasn't just the hysteria. It wasn't just trying to get money. There's a lot of factors combined to just make chaos. Women who were midwives were suspect. Why? Because babies died. Babies died all the time back then. How many babies did John Brown bury? We didn't go over this in the video, but John Brown buried a lot of babies. That entire era, up until 1900, you just buried babies. It just happened. Children didn't live that long. So a midwife, if she delivered a stillborn, which was bound to happen, suspicion, maybe she's a witch. If the child fell out of a tree at 8 years old, suspicion, maybe she bewitched the child. So midwives were often suspect. And they were often poor women. So, because because midwife was a job that was looked down upon. And so poor women did that job. It was one of the few jobs that women can do, which is interesting. I don't have time to go into it in this video, but shortly around the time of Salem, they finally allowed women to work so they could earn money because it was becoming a problem. There weren't enough dowries. They weren't able to get married. The social dynamic was changing from the time they first settled the colony in the 1630s. They had to say, okay, these women can work so that these servant girls, very interesting about the servant girls, they probably didn't have very good marriage prospects because they wouldn't have gotten very good dowries. They wouldn't have gotten good dowries. Some of them would and did, but some of them were victims of the Maine colonies and the Indian border wars in Maine. And Abigail goes into this when she threatens them in the room, and she's like, I saw an Indian person smash my mother's brains into the pillow next to mine, and I'll come and get you in a night. Great performance. But we see that these girls were seriously traumatized by what had happened to them in Maine. Many of them were orphans or had lost a parent of the possessed, whereas we see the non-possessed accusers, most of them were not orphans. So there's definitely a different social dynamic. And these were young girls. They were largely powerless. They were servant girls. And we see that hysteria is often the language of the oppressed. I'm not making any excuses for what happened to them and for what they did, because there's no excuses to be made. People died. Innocent people died. But just to say that when you see hysteria, it often comes along with stress. We saw stress in Salem itself. Prior to this, it was like a tinderbox. And these stressed out, anxiety-ridden girls who didn't have very great prospects for their future or for marriage, they were under stress. And so that was the spark that set Salem off. It's the drama of the whole thing. This is what I feel. So Salem sparked off with the possessions, which is so dramatic. You know, it's much more dramatic than a neighbor coming in and saying, Goody Osborne down the road is bewitching my cattle. Goody Osborne down the road is hag riding me in the night. That's not very dramatic, but you get a group of like 6 to 12. In the movie, it looked like there were about 12. The drama of the young girl accusing other people is just so immense. It's captivating. And to this day, people are captivated by young women. The ingenue sort of character, the beautiful young lady, the pure thing. People just like to look at young women. One, they just like to look at them. And two, the opposite of that pure character, this thing of innocence and beauty, is the harlot, where Abigail was accused of harlotry. It's like, she's a hoe. This is a hoe. This is a home-wrecking hoe. That's what we call it now, but harlotry. And so there is this general fear in culture that this woman is going to use her power to ensnare a man and to hurt him and to destroy him, which that only happens like a third of the time. I don't know why men are so scared of that. Ladies in the audience, you should be proud of yourself if you've gone the whole year without ensnaring and destroying a man with your beauty. So good on you. Don't use this power for evil. Only use this power for good. But it is something in our culture. It's like one of those myths that, a girl could turn. We want to protect these women and we want to keep them safe, but they can also turn and use their sexual powers for evil, to corrupt, for Satan. Society has just never overcome this fascination or fear of young women. And so now I have the only criticism I will give of The Crucible, because so much do I love Arthur Miller and what he has done and what the actors and actresses did, what the director did. Mwah. The only criticism. Why is the lead a man, though? It's just funny to me. It's just funny to me that the lead is a man and the villain is a young woman. Yes, in Salem, the villains, the possessed, were young women. But nothing would have happened if the men in charge didn't listen to what they had to say. Whereas older women were saying, these girls are being silly. Let's ignore them and let's go on with our lives. But in Salem, the judge, we see Judge Hawthorne. Yes, that is Nathaniel Hawthorne's great-grandfather. And yes, Nathaniel Hawthorne did change his name to get away from the stigma of this awful, awful, greasy man. And he's listening to Abigail, and he could just say at any point, no, you're full of it. And some of the men did, and this is what really bothers me, is that they didn't just say enough. The hangman, why didn't the hangman say no? Why didn't any of these people say no? And now we know from this story that we all have an obligation to say no when something like this happens. Anyway, back to my criticism of The Crucible. Why is John Proctor a man? Why is there a love story? And I get it. You know, it's the 50s. We want to make it sexy. No one's going to go out to see a female lead. We need to make this about a man. We see the misogyny of the 50s discussing the misogyny of the 1600s. So that's interesting. It's one of my only criticisms. And I don't like the fact that the mythos, the mythology of the witch trials is about a rational man battling irrational young women. What really it should be is rationality and whatever battling an irrational state who's exceeded their authority and is prideful. You see, these Puritans were accusing everybody else of pride. They're accusing these mouthy women of pride. They accuse the devil. Pride is a devil sin. We discussed that very briefly. They accuse everybody else of pride. But who is the most prideful, if not these judges standing in judgment of other people? Anyway, that's one of my only criticisms, is that why is the mythology around the Salem witch trials still spoken as if a man could have, if they had just listened to this man, this noble man who was not very kind to his wife. Even in the movie, he's not very kind to his wife. So it's still misogynistic, a little bit misogynistic. However, I get it. It's the 50s. We haven't had the women's movement yet. We're still dealing with that mindset that pervaded in Salem and sort of snuck its way in through our whole history, and we still deal with it at the end. So to me, that's just interesting. To me, it's just interesting that we're looking through it through that lens, because if you look at the history of the witch trials, which I will bring you more videos, I promise, and in Europe, and what happened in Europe, and in New England, and in England, because we come from England, you see that it was a persecution of women. So why is a man representing this? It's fine. It's fine. It's whatever. And then the other mythology we have around witches is that they're genuinely evil. And these old hags are out to get us. You know, we have all these witch movies, et cetera, et cetera. Really, if you go back to what happened back then, it was a horror movie of these awful, awful people, these courts and the state and just these awful men, the upper classes, attacking poor women, torturing them, murdering them, their families turning them in. If we're going to make a horror movie about the witch era, it's not going to be the witches who are the villains here. It's going to be the state. Anyway, that's my diatribe. I still love the movie. I love everything about the movie. I'm just saying, I saw what happened there. I see it. I'm not exactly happy with it. I understand that's what Arthur Miller had to do because he is a man and he is writing about it from his perspective. And we have John Proctor very vocal about his opposition to his wife being accused, his third wife, Elizabeth, because he's much older at this time. And Elizabeth gets accused and he's like, this is a nonsense. No, she isn't. He's too mouthy. He gets hanged. Elizabeth does live because she was pregnant at the time. And by the time she had given birth and by the time it was time for her to be hanged, everyone in Massachusetts was just like, oops, we kind of got carried away. We got carried away. What? Sometimes you're going to have a witch craze. So, sorry, we killed your husband. I'm going to end this with a few points. One of those points is that we see that Boston put the kibosh on this. That the capitalists, the mercantile class in Boston said, no, we need to make money. Y'all need to knock it off. So yes, from 2021, we look back and we criticize capitalism because maybe it is starting to outlive its usefulness. Maybe it's getting corrupt. It is getting corrupt and it's outliving its usefulness. But from 1692 and early, we also see that capitalism is a force for peace because you got to let the markets run. And when you're dealing with something that is so insane as what was happening in the 15 and 1600s, then capitalism is actually very helpful. But, you know, looking back on it, we have a lot of criticism of capitalism from today. So just keep that in mind, that at the time, capitalism was actually a force for peace in Salem. Ironically, in the 1950s Red Scare, the government attacked the movie industry to defend capitalism. It's the circle The circle of life and persecution. The Crucible, as Arthur Miller wrote it, because he's also a storyteller, and this is where he shines, is about a scorned woman. It is about interpersonal relationships, and people can digest that. That's much easier to digest than perhaps what really happened, which is just stress and anxiety and rage bubbling below the surface, as well as fear of the unknown, deep, deep fear. Nathaniel Hawthorne writes about it in Young Goodman Brown. I'll do a video on that at some point. I love Nathaniel Hawthorne. I love Young Goodman Brown. But fear that the devil is in there, that he's in the woods, because the woods were filled with angry Indians who would smash your head in because you're on their property. You're on their land and you paid them in some magic beans. So maybe some people needed to get some heads smashed. And I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't. I'm just saying that's what's in the woods. And the woods are genuinely a scary place. And maybe the devil is there. And maybe they associate Indians with the devil and all these things that are going on in their brain. Keep in mind, they didn't know about randomness back then. They didn't know about weather patterns. They didn't know about a lot of illnesses. 370 years later, still people don't understand randomness. I'm going to put a book right there that you should read about randomness if you're unclear about randomness and the nature of life is random, and things happen and we try to ascribe meaning, but really it's just you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It could have happened to anybody. So yeah, they didn't understand about that. And so that fear of the unknown, the fear of the future, the fear of life just being so hard, combined with economic factors, combined with strife in the community, set this thing off. And that's so hard to understand. But, we get scorned young girl, handsome man, bada bing, bada boom, we got a hit. This is the movies. This is Hollywood. You got to keep it going. Make it easy to understand for the people. To end this all, I hope I can keep this video under 40 minutes, but to end this all, I would just like to end with a quote from, where's my book? I'd like to end with a quote from Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. And I love this man. I love this man with all my heart because he's a shit talker to the first degree. I love it. And he was a shit talker when it was harder to talk shit because you had to talk shit with a quill. Do you know how dedicated you have to be to pick up a quill to say what you got to say? Anyway, I'll just end it with this quote. It is related that the Indian tribes in New England were sorely puzzled at the infatuation of the settlers and thought them either a race inferior to or more sinful than the French colonists in the vicinity, amongst whom, as they remarked, the Great Spirit sent no witches.
I thought then, in the so-called liberal times of Kennedy, and that this whole thing had not ended. That we really hadn't traced it down and run it to earth. And this new generation is finding that the repressive thing in human nature hasn't gone away. And in this system, but it's not just in this system. They're mistaken if they think that.
Happy Halloween. Pour some candy on the sidewalk for the fallen witches. The poor victims, the accused, that were murdered by this awful, awful state. And remember that when the state takes you over, there's rarely any justice. Reese's candy on the ground. Don't go pouring candy corn. That's how you get cursed. I love you all.